It is 2 in the morning and you are still awake. Your mind is replaying a conversation that has not happened yet. You are losing an argument to someone who is asleep in another house, completely unaware you are even fighting them. Your chest is tight, your jaw is clenched, and nothing at all has actually gone wrong. But a Roman statesman already solved this 2,000 years ago. His name was Seneca, and in a letter to a friend, he wrote a single sentence that explains almost everything about why your mind does this to you. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality, he said. Read that again, not less. More, your imagined disasters are heavier than your real ones. Why would a philosopher writing under a tyrant's watch, a man who would later be ordered to take his own life, spend his final years teaching people how to stop being afraid of things that were not happening? Because he had already lived through the things that were. Lucius Annerius Seneca was born around 4 BC in what is now southern Spain, and by the time he reached Rome, he had survived exile, illness, and the kind of political violence that ended most careers with a blade. He was banished to the island of Corsica for 8 years on a corruption charge historians still consider mostly invented, torn away from his family, his career, everything he had built. Then he was recalled, made tutor and advisor to a teenage boy who would grow up to become the Emperor Nero. For a while, Seneca held real power. He helped run an empire, and then slowly, he watched the boy he had raised turn into one of the most dangerous men alive. By his 60s, Seneca had retired from public life, sensing what was coming. He spent his final years writing letters to a younger friend named Lucilius, a series of philosophical essays we still read today as letters from a Stoic. In them, he is not writing as a man who never suffered. He is writing as a man who suffered constantly and studied his own suffering the way a scientist studies a specimen. That is what makes the line about imagination so different from a modern quote about positive thinking. This was not optimism. This was diagnosis. Think about the last time you dreaded something. A difficult phone call, a medical test, a hard conversation with someone you love. How much of that dread happened before anything actually occurred? Seneca noticed that the human mind does something strange under pressure. It does not wait for evidence. It runs simulations. It builds an entire courtroom in your head, complete with a prosecutor, a jury, and a verdict, all before the actual event has said a single word. And here is the part that should unsettle you a little. Most of those simulations never come true. You rehearse a disaster that never arrives, and the rehearsal itself becomes the disaster. Seneca called this the mind's tendency to believe rumor over fact. In Letter 13, he tells Lucilius directly that some things torment us more than they should, some torment us before they should, and some torment us when they should not at all. 3 separate failures of the mind, and he lists them like a doctor naming symptoms. Torment beyond what is warranted, torment ahead of what has happened, torment over what will never happen. Sound familiar? This is where the philosophy gets its teeth. Seneca was not telling Lucilius to simply relax, or to think positive, or to distract himself with pleasure. That would have meant nothing to a Stoic. Instead, he taught something almost the opposite. He told his student to examine the fear directly. Ask what, exactly, are you afraid of? Not the vague cloud of anxiety, but the specific event. Say it out loud. Look at it. Because a fear given a name and a shape is almost always smaller than the shapeless dread that came before it. There is a companion idea here, one the Stoics practiced deliberately, called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. It sounds bleak at first. Sit down and imagine the worst that could happen. Losing your job, losing your health, losing someone you love. But the purpose was never to marinate in despair. The purpose was to drain the fear of its power by meeting it on your own terms, in a quiet room, rather than being ambushed by it at 2 in the morning with your heart pounding. Marcus Aurelius, writing his private notebook decades later, practiced a version of this every morning, reminding himself that he might meet people that day who were ungrateful, or violent, or dishonest, so that when he actually met them, nothing about the world had the power to surprise him into anger. The rehearsal was not the punishment. The rehearsal was the vaccine. Here is the counterintuitive twist most people miss when they first hear this teaching. You would think facing your worst fears head-on would make you more anxious, not less. But the opposite happens. Vague fear is infinite. It has no edges, no size, no end. Specific fear is finite. It has a shape you can actually reason about. When you force yourself to say the actual worst-case sentence out loud, whether that is I might lose this job, or I might be alone, or I might fail in front of people I respect, you almost always find the same thing Seneca found. The sentence is survivable. It is uncomfortable, even painful, but it is not the endless abyss your imagination had been building in the dark. Epictetus, another Stoic teacher who had lived through something far worse than imagined suffering. Having spent years enslaved before eventually earning his freedom and becoming one of Rome's most respected philosophers, taught a related distinction that fits perfectly alongside Seneca's letter. He divided the world into two categories: things within your control and things outside it. Your thoughts, your choices, your responses, not within your control. Other people's opinions, the outcome of events, the future itself. Most of the suffering you experience at 2 in the morning comes from spending your energy on the second category as if it belonged to the first. You cannot control whether the email gets a good response. You cannot control what the doctor says before the test results come back. Your imagination, though, does not know the difference. It treats the uncontrollable future as though it were already a fact you must manage right now. Modern psychology arrived at something remarkably close to this 2,000 years later, though it did not know it was retracing old ground. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most well-documented and effective treatments for anxiety, is built on the idea that distorted thoughts, not external events, generate most emotional distress. Therapists ask patients to identify catastrophic thinking, to write down the actual feared outcome, to examine the evidence for and against it. That is Seneca's method, almost word for word, developed independently by clinicians who were simply trying to help people stop suffering from things that had not happened. The Roman statesman and the 20th century psychiatrist arrived at the same room from two different doors. Consider how this plays out somewhere as ordinary as your inbox. You send a message to someone important. An hour passes with no reply. Then 2. Your mind starts drafting reasons. They are angry, you said something wrong, the opportunity is gone, none of that is information. It is fiction assembled at speed out of silence alone. Seneca would ask you to notice the exact moment you crossed from fact into fiction. The fact was, no reply yet. Everything after that was imagination wearing the costume of certainty. This is the trick anxious thinking plays on you constantly. It borrows the tone of fact, while offering none of the evidence. The same pattern shows up in relationships, in health scares, in waiting on a decision that is out of your hands. A pain in your side becomes, by midnight, a catastrophe with a name and a prognosis, built entirely without a doctor in the room. A friend's short reply becomes a verdict on the friendship. Seneca's letters return again and again to this same warning, because he watched it happen in himself as often as in Lucilius. He was not immune to it. He simply refused to let it go unexamined. That refusal, that willingness to interrogate a feeling instead of obeying it, is the entire discipline in miniature. So what does this actually look like in your life tonight? The next time your mind starts building a courtroom out of nothing, Seneca would tell you to stop and ask 3 questions. Is this happening right now, in this moment, or am I only imagining that it might? If it is only imagined, what is the actual likelihood? Based on evidence, not fear. And if the worst version did happen, what would you actually do the next morning? Not spiral. Do, because you would do something, you always do. Human beings are remarkably good at handling reality once it arrives. It is the waiting room of imagination where we fall apart. There is something almost tender in knowing that the man who wrote this was not lecturing from comfort. Seneca eventually lost everything he had spent his life building. In the year 65, accused, likely falsely, of conspiring against Nero, he was ordered to end his own life. Historical accounts describe him facing that final order with the same composure he had spent decades writing about, comforting the people around him rather than the other way around. Whatever you think of how he lived, it is hard to ignore how he ended. A man who had spent his whole life studying imagined suffering met real suffering, the final and total kind. Without the panic he had warned Lucilius against. You are not facing anything close to that tonight. Most of what keeps you awake is smaller than you think, dressed up by your imagination to look larger than it is. The message left on read, the comment that stung more than it should have, the meeting tomorrow that your mind has already decided will go badly. None of it has happened yet. Some of it never will. Somewhere in your life right now, something small is making you afraid. Before you let it cost you another sleepless hour, ask yourself the question a Roman exile asked 2,000 years ago, and see how much smaller the fear gets once you actually look at it. It is 2 in the morning again somewhere for someone. But this time, you already know what Seneca knew. The thing keeping you awake was never the reality. It was only ever the imagination.